you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Save yourself, come down from the cross. In the same way the chief priest, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, he served others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe. Those who were crucified with him also haunted him.
Let us remain seated and sing verse 1 and 4 of Were You There?
John 19, 1-6. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged, and the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him up in a purple robe. They kept coming up to him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and striking him on the face. Pilate went out again and said to them, Look, I am bringing him out to you, to let you know that I find no cause against him. So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, Here is the man. When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate told them, Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him.
You could take for a moment and see yourself in that time in which Jesus is sitting around the table, and he's sitting with friends, and he's sitting with family, and he's broken bread. He shared with them that they are to break bread continuously together, to be reminded of his presence. He tells them things that they don't understand. He tells them that this cup that he is lifting up is a cup of his blood. It is a cup of sacrifice. It is a cup of love. And he tells them that things from this point forward will change, that a new thing is about to happen. Then he invites some friends along with him. He invites some of those who have traveled with him in these 3 years in the closest of ways. And he invites them to take a journey into the night air and into the garden. They walk out of that upper room, and the city is still alive with action and noise and celebration of the Passover feast. The temple is in the distance, now dark at night. They walk, and then they're in the valley, and they go across a small brook in the Kidron Valley. A brook on ordinary days that you barely needed to step across with one broad strap. But tonight, because of all the sacrifice that has taken place at the temple, this brook is colored red from the sacrifice of the lambs. And so they take broad steps across the brook of blood and into the garden. It's cool, and the trees are slightly rustling. The garden is quiet. They sit down, and Jesus asks them to stay and to pray with him. And then he goes a distance and says a prayer. Lord our God, I just ask that you allow us to be in this moment and to be aware of your presence, to realize that there are so many emotions that go on in life, and that in this 1 week you had so many emotions taking place. And allow us to look to you. We also ask you to just be with Nicole, Lord. In Jesus' name, Amen. Have you ever had this feeling that you were to do something? That there was something that you were responsible to do, and you absolutely knew that it was the right thing to do? It is almost as if God's self came to you and invited you to take part in something special with Him. You know, sometimes God calls us to do the most outlandish things that every person around you thinks that you're absolutely out of your mind. And yet, if you're in that spot, you know, no matter what anyone else says, you are required to do that. Has anyone felt that way besides myself? Like, oh, I'm just got to do something, and yeah, it does not make sense. It does not make sense, but we're just going to go for it. You know, we try to follow God, and we try to also have, you know, a semblance of, you know, people not thinking that we're crazy religion people, right? You know, we want people around us to like us. We want our fellow workers to not go, oh, she's one of them, you know? You know, and so what ends up happening is it puts us in a really tough place. We want the approval of our closest friends. And yet, sometimes when God gives us a really clear instruction that we know we need to follow, we sometimes think, you know what? I don't really know if my friends are going to have my back on this one. And when we receive that kind of instruction and we need to go forward, what ends up happening is that we have to do what is difficult. And unfortunately, sometimes it puts us in a place in which we are alone. And then this is exactly where Jesus finds himself. When those closest to him have been trying to tell him all along, you are it. This is the moment. This is the moment in which we have all been working for. This is the moment in which you are going to be made the King of Kings. This is the moment that we do not need to worry about the tyranny of Rome being over us anymore. This is the moment in which we are going to be free. We're going to have lots of money, and it almost sounds like a political speech, right? No more taxes for anyone ever. You know, in that moment, Jesus knew that despite what his closest friends were telling him, he needed to do what God the Father was telling him. And it wasn't going to be easy, because he knew in the end they just probably would not have his back. Not from a lack of love, and the same thing with our friends. It's not because they don't love us. It's just because they don't understand. You know, we have the advantage of looking at this, you know, from the outside. We have almost a Monday morning quarterback position. You know, when we say, oh, he should have put that guy in. We understand that Jesus had to do what he had to do. And we say, you know what? We wouldn't have fallen asleep in the garden. Or we wouldn't have been Judas. We wouldn't have gone for the money. Or we wouldn't have been Peter. We would have said, I know him. He's my friend. But that's because we had advantage of seeing the story, this side of the resurrection. But you know, sometimes for us, we don't know what the end of our story is. We don't know what the end is going to look like for our being obedient. And so we need to continue to be obedient even when our closest friends just don't get it. Jesus' entry into the city he called upon the people and he said, Hosanna. They were calling upon him and saying, Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. And yet, in the midst of all these praises, he was humble, not coming in on a big white stallion, a big horse, on a big chariot, but instead on a humble donkey. You know, the things that God often asks us to do have a lot more, and they look a lot more like donkey riding than horse riding. I don't know, has anyone ever had the chance to ride a donkey? Oh, snap. Was really somebody had a chance to, Tom, Damien? Okay, yeah, donkey riding. Now, did you also ever ride horses? Yes, and donkey riding and horse riding are two different things, right? Like, donkeys are lower, they don't go as smoothly as horses, they're a little bumpy and slow, and yeah. We wouldn't choose to pick the donkey theology. We don't want to go slow. We don't want the road to be bumpy. We don't want our feet to be touching the ground. Instead, we want to be flying through. When Jesus rode in on that day, and he was the King of Kings, and he proceeded to show them what the king, when the king is coming from heaven, looks like. It was not just about the humble arriving, but it was all the pieces of the story put together. It's the arrival, and the breaking of bread, and the sharing of the cup, and the washing of the feet. It was the moment in which the woman came and anointed his feet, and wiped his feet with her hair. All of these pieces came together to tell the story that needed to be told. And in the ultimate act of obedience and sacrifice, Jesus, God's Son, took upon himself all of the shame of the earth, all of the missteps, all of the things that we've done wrong, and all of the things that people from all ages and all time have done wrong. It is the ultimate act of love to say that even though I could come, and I could come as the king, instead I'm going to come as the rider of the donkey. Small, unimportant, humble, and poor. This Holy Week is about obedience, because we need to remember that as much as Jesus was God, Jesus was also a human, and we don't like riding the donkey. We want to ride the horse. And so therefore, Jesus, in his humanness, would not have chosen donkey riding. But Holy Week tells us that when you travel with Jesus, it requires you to be obedient to God. The story begins with Jesus telling two of his followers to go to a place, and there they would find a donkey and its colt tied up together. And they were to go and to take them. And if anyone asked you something, just say the master sent you. Now, you were like, oh, it's a donkey, who really cares, kind of thing. But I want us to realize it's kind of like if somebody sent you and said, you know, go and there's going to be a Volkswagen someplace, and I want you to just jump in and, you know, hotwire the thing and drive it away. And if anybody says anything to you, just say, yeah, the master sent me. You know, how obedient would we be to that? You know, not good instructions, but they did follow. I wonder, when we believe that God is giving us directions, are we willing to do the same, to be obedient? So often God tries to tell us something, but instead we're like, oh yeah, that wasn't God. That was just, you know, some silliness in my mind. Because we want to go on our own little merry way and pretend not to hear it. God doesn't really want me to do that. Or, oh, this is a favorite of mine. Or we have the million questions. As a mom, I am even a mom of adult children. I am always surprised why I cannot say, I want you to do this, and somebody just says yes. Why doesn't that happen? You know, instead, it's like, well, why do we have to do this? And, you know, do we have to do this now? And do you really know what you're doing? And, you know, 10,000 questions. But Jesus doesn't ask all the questions. Instead, he's obedient and prays. If we notice, Jesus goes into this realizing that most of this trip he'll likely do alone. Most of this trip he will just be able to hold on to the fact that he is being obedient to God. And he's still willing to obey. You know, I know a lot of times the hardest thing for me is when God asks me to do something, to trust all the way through the process. To trust that when things aren't going my way, that is going to be the way that God is going to open the doors that are necessary. About, I guess it was about 1996, I felt like God was sharing with me that, and I know that always sounds weird, especially if you're not a church person. God is telling me, but it's just a sense, and you've prayed about it, and it just keeps coming back to you, that I needed to finish up, or I needed to get back into college. At that point, I had a small child, a teenager. I was working 2 jobs. One of it is we owned our own business, and it just did not make sense to go back to college. But I found that you could take college classes, and you know, today we would call it online learning, but back then it was called distance learning. And so what would happen is they would send you books in the mail, and then you would fill out this package, and then you had videotapes, you know, and you put them in your VCR, and you watched them, and it was absolutely torturous. It really was. It was not anything I was interested in whatsoever. But I proceeded through, and as I continued on the journey, a lot of it just seemed silly and unnecessary. Like, who needs math, really? I don't know why we learn that, you know, we have calculators. But I processed through with people encouraging me, saying, you know, just do it. And all of those years of work are finally coming and culminating together, and actually I'm taking my last class in my master's degree. And they called me this week, and they told me that I get to defend my thesis, and they gave me a date, and I took my graduation picture, and I ordered my cap and gown, and you know, I'm like, I can't believe it. But it was about being obedient. because I would not have chosen this path on my own. And I know that God has placed things in all of your hearts because God has a desire. And most of the time, it's going to look like riding on a donkey. It's going to have a lot of getting dirty, feet dragging, and a lot of bumps. But if you are doing this with God, amazing things will happen. So today I ask you, as we observe Holy Week, are you willing to at least consider what are the things that God is asking me to do? And am I willing to be obedient? And then, especially if there are things that you don't want to do, will you realize that Jesus was willing to die? Something he was willing to do, but didn't want to do. And so maybe we can die to our own self-reliance. Can we be available for God and God's use? Can we be a part of God's plan?